The humid air of Miami hung heavy that September evening in 2008 as Agent Daniel Parker packed his go-bag for what would become his final assignment. The 34-year-old federal agent had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, he would vanish without a trace in the sprawling favelas of Rio de Janeiro, leaving behind only questions that would haunt his colleagues for 15 years. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel by clicking the icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now let's get into the story. Daniel had built a reputation as one of the Bureau's most reliable operatives. His Methodist upbringing in small-town Georgia had instilled in him a deep sense of duty and an unwavering moral compass. These qualities made him the perfect choice for Operation Crossroads, a joint task force between the FBI and Brazilian authorities targeting an international drug trafficking ring that had been funneling cocaine through South American ports into major American cities. The operation was classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of people knew that Daniel would be working undercover in Brazil, posing as a corrupt American businessman looking to invest in the drug trade. His cover identity was solid, his Portuguese passable, and his determination absolute. He believed, as he always had, that God had called him to serve his country and protect innocent lives from the poison that flowed through these criminal networks. Detective Grace Mitchell from the Miami-Dade Police Department had been Daniel's primary contact stateside. She was brilliant, dedicated, and shared his faith-driven approach to law enforcement. The two had worked together on several cases over the past 3 years, developing a professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. Captain Henry Morgan had personally selected Daniel for this assignment. The gruff, experienced officer had seen something special in the younger agent, a combination of street smarts and genuine compassion that made him perfect for undercover work. Henry understood that this mission would test Daniel's limits, but he also knew that if anyone could infiltrate the dangerous world of international drug trafficking and come back alive, it was Daniel Parker. The night before his departure, Daniel met with his closest friend and fellow agent, Samuel Bailey. Sam had been Daniel's partner for over 5 years, and the two men had developed the kind of bond that only comes from facing danger together. They shared a quiet dinner at their favorite diner, where they often went to discuss cases and life in general. "You sure about this, Danny?" Sam asked, stirring his coffee nervously. "Brazil's a different world, man. These guys don't play games." Daniel smiled, his blue eyes reflecting the certainty that had always defined him. "Sam, I've never been more sure of anything. This operation could save thousands of lives back home. Kids who won't have to face the temptation of drugs, because we stopped the supply at its source." Sam nodded, understanding his friend's conviction, but unable to shake the feeling that something was different about this assignment. There was an edge to Daniel's voice, a tension that hadn't been there before. But he trusted his partner's judgment, just as he had learned to trust in God's plan for both their lives. The next morning, Daniel boarded a commercial flight to Rio de Janeiro. He carried with him a false passport, identifying him as David Palmer, a businessman from Atlanta looking to expand his import business into South America. His cover story was simple but effective. He was supposedly interested in legitimate business opportunities but willing to look the other way if certain shipments contained more than what appeared on the manifest. Daniel's handler in Brazil was supposed to be Agent Carlos Mendoza, a seasoned operative who had been working the South American drug circuit for over a decade. The plan was straightforward. Daniel would establish contact with mid-level traffickers in Rio, work his way up the chain, and gather intelligence on the major players shipping drugs to the United States. The first week went according to plan. Daniel made contact with several small-time dealers in the touristy areas of Copacabana and Ipanema. His cover held up perfectly. He was just another American businessman with questionable morals and deep pockets. He rented a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood and began building the relationships that would eventually lead him to the bigger fish. Grace Mitchell monitored his progress from Miami, receiving coded messages through secure channels every 48 hours. Daniel's reports were professional and detailed, but she could sense his growing unease. The deeper he went into the criminal underworld, the more dangerous his situation became. On his 8th day in Rio, Daniel made a breakthrough. He was introduced to a man named Eduardo Santos, a mid-level coordinator who controlled drug shipments through the port of Santos. Eduardo was suspicious but intrigued by the American's proposition. He agreed to meet Daniel at a small cafe in Santa Teresa, a hillside neighborhood known for its artistic community and winding streets. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Daniel arrived early, positioning himself at a corner table where he could observe the street and have multiple exit routes. Eduardo arrived precisely on time, accompanied by 2 bodyguards who positioned themselves at nearby tables. "Mr. Palmer," Eduardo said in accented English, "I understand you are interested in expanding your business." Daniel nodded, playing his role perfectly. "I am. I've heard that certain opportunities exist for businessmen who are willing to be flexible." About their cargo manifests, Eduardo studied him carefully. "Such opportunities do exist, but they require significant trust. And trust, Mr. Palmer, is earned over time." The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Daniel walked a careful line, showing interest without appearing too eager, asking questions that demonstrated business acumen without revealing his true knowledge of law enforcement techniques. By the end of the meeting, Eduardo had agreed to introduce him to someone higher up the chain. That night, Daniel sent his regular report to Grace. His message was brief but optimistic. "Making progress. Next-level contact established. All systems normal." Those would be the last words anyone would hear from Agent Daniel Parker. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. 3 days passed without any communication from Daniel. Grace Mitchell stared at her computer screen in the Miami FBI field office, refreshing her secure message system every few minutes. The silence was deafening, and a cold knot of dread had settled in her stomach. "Still nothing?" Sam Bailey asked, appearing at her cubicle with 2 cups of coffee. His normally cheerful demeanor was replaced by worry lines around his eyes. Grace shook her head. "He's never missed a check-in. Not once in all the time I've known him." Captain Henry Morgan called an emergency meeting that afternoon. The small conference room felt cramped as the core team gathered around the table. Grace, Sam, and 3 other agents sat in tense silence as Henry reviewed the situation. "Gentlemen and lady," Henry began, his voice gravelly from years of chain smoking, "we have a problem. Agent Parker has been dark for 72 hours. Our contact in Brazil, Agent Mendoza, has been unable to locate him." Grace leaned forward. "What's the last known location?" "His apartment in Botafogo. The landlord says he hasn't been seen since Thursday morning. His rental car is missing, and there's no activity on any of his credit cards or bank accounts." Sam's jaw tightened. "What about his meeting with Eduardo Santos? Did that take place?" Henry consulted his notes. According to Mendoza's sources, the meeting happened as scheduled. Santos claims Parker left the cafe around 4 p.m. and said he would be in touch. That's the last confirmed sighting. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Daniel Parker, one of the FBI's most experienced undercover agents, had simply vanished without a trace in one of the world's most dangerous cities. "We need to go down there," Sam said, his voice tight with emotion. "We need to find him." Henry shook his head. "Absolutely not. We can't risk blowing the entire operation or putting more agents in danger. Mendoza has people on the ground conducting a search." Grace felt her heart racing. She had seen Daniel just 2 weeks ago, sitting in this very conference room, confident and prepared for the mission ahead. The idea that he might be lying dead in some Rio favela was almost too much to bear. "What if he's been taken?" she asked. "What if his cover was blown?" "Then we pray that he's still alive and that we can find him," Henry replied grimly. "But we have to be realistic about the possibilities." Over the next week, the search intensified. Agent Mendoza worked with local Brazilian authorities to canvass the neighborhoods where Daniel had been operating. They interviewed informants, checked hospitals and morgues, and followed up on every possible lead. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. Daniel's rental car was found abandoned on a side street in Rechinha, one of Rio's largest favelas. The vehicle showed no signs of violence, but it had been stripped of anything valuable. Local police treated it as a routine theft, but Mendoza knew better. The location was significant. Rechinha was controlled by drug traffickers who would have little tolerance for an undercover federal agent. Grace found herself working 18-hour days, coordinating with the search efforts and analyzing every piece of intelligence that came in. She slept at her desk more nights than she cared to count, surviving on coffee and prayer. Her Methodist faith had always been a source of strength, but now she found herself questioning why God would allow such a dedicated servant to disappear. Sam was dealing with his own emotional turmoil. He had been Daniel's partner for years, and the two men had developed an almost telepathic understanding in the field. The fact that Daniel had vanished without any distress signal or indication of trouble made Sam feel like he had failed his friend somehow. "I should have insisted on going with him," Sam told Grace one evening as they worked late in the office. "Partners don't split up, especially not on something this dangerous." "You know, Daniel," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady, "he would never have agreed to put you at risk. This was his mission, his choice. That doesn't make it any easier." 2 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, Agent Mendoza requested permission to expand the search into the interior of Brazil. Intelligence suggested that high-value targets were sometimes moved to remote locations in the Amazon basin, where they could be held indefinitely without risk of discovery. Henry approved the request, but he also made a difficult decision. After consulting with FBI headquarters in Washington, he officially classified Daniel Parker as missing in action, with the strong possibility that he had been killed in the line of duty. The news hit the Miami field office like a physical blow. Daniel had been popular among his colleagues, known for his integrity, his sense of humor, and his willingness to help anyone who needed it. The thought that he might be dead was almost unbearable. Grace attended the memorial service held at Daniel's home church in Atlanta. His parents, Robert and Mary Parker, were devastated but drew strength from their faith and from the knowledge that their son had died serving others. The sanctuary was packed with FBI agents, local law enforcement officers, and members of the community who had known Daniel throughout his life. The pastor, Reverend William Thompson, delivered a powerful eulogy that focused on Daniel's character rather than the circumstances of his disappearance. "Daniel Parker was a man who lived his faith every day," the Reverend said. "He believed that God had called him to serve and protect others, and he answered that call with courage and dedication. We may not understand why he has been taken from us, but we can trust that his sacrifice was not in vain." As Grace sat in the pew, tears streaming down her face, she made a silent promise to Daniel's memory. She would never stop looking for answers. She would never stop hoping that somehow, somewhere he was still alive. Chapter 3. The search continues. The months that followed Daniel's disappearance were marked by frustration and dead ends. Agent Mendoza continued his investigation in Brazil, but the trail had gone cold. The drug trafficking network that Daniel had been investigating seemed to have vanished as completely as the agent himself. Grace Mitchell threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. She requested a transfer to the FBI's International Crimes Division, where she could dedicate more time to cases involving American citizens abroad. Her colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. She had become more focused, more driven, but also more withdrawn. Sam Bailey struggled with his own demons. He had requested reassignment to the Brazilian operation, but his superiors had denied the request. They needed him in Miami, they said, and his emotional investment in the case made him a liability in the field. Sam understood the logic, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. Captain Henry Morgan announced his retirement 6 months after Daniel's disappearance. The loss of one of his best agents had taken a toll on the veteran officer, and he felt responsible for sending Daniel into harm's way. His replacement, Captain Jennifer Walsh, was younger and more aggressive, but she lacked Henry's institutional knowledge and personal connection to the case. The official investigation was scaled back after the first year. The FBI maintained a presence in Brazil, but Daniel's case became just one of many cold cases in the International Crimes Database. Grace continued to receive occasional updates from Agent Mendoza, but they were increasingly sparse and unhelpful. In 2010, 2 years after Daniel's disappearance, Grace received a call that made her heart race. Agent Mendoza had arrested a mid-level trafficker named Roberto Silva, who claimed to have information about the missing American agent. Grace flew to Rio de Janeiro the next day, her first trip to Brazil since Daniel's disappearance. The city was exactly as she had imagined it, beautiful and dangerous, with stunning beaches and sprawling favelas existing side by side. She could understand why Daniel had been drawn to the assignment, but she could also see how easy it would be for someone to disappear in such a vast, complex urban environment. Roberto Silva was a small, nervous man in his 40s who had been arrested for drug possession with intent to distribute. He sat across from Grace and Agent Mendoza in a small interrogation room at the Rio police headquarters, chain-smoking and fidgeting with his hands. "You say you have information about Agent Parker?" Grace asked in Portuguese, which she had been studying intensively since Daniel's disappearance. Roberto nodded eagerly. Yes, the American. I know what happened to him. Tell us." He was asking too many questions, the wrong questions. Eduardo Santos became suspicious. Grace felt her pulse quicken. This was the first concrete lead they had received in months. What kind of questions? About the boats, about the routes, about the people in charge. He knew too much for a regular businessman. Agent Mendoza leaned forward. What did Santos do? Roberto's eyes darted nervously around the room. He reported it to his boss. The boss decided the American was a problem. Who was the boss? I don't know his real name. Everyone called him O'Shafe, the boss. He controlled everything from the docks to the distribution network. Grace struggled to keep her voice steady. What happened to the American? Roberto was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally he spoke. They took him to a warehouse in the industrial district. That's all I know, I swear. Is he alive? I don't know. That was 2 years ago. Grace and Agent Mendoza spent the next 3 days searching the industrial district, checking every warehouse and abandoned building they could find. They discovered evidence of drug processing and packaging operations, but no sign of Daniel Parker or any indication that he had ever been held in the area. Roberto's information proved to be partially accurate. They did find the warehouse he had described, and forensic analysis revealed traces of blood and evidence of recent violence. But the building had been abandoned for months, and any evidence of Daniel's presence had long since been destroyed. Grace returned to Miami with more questions than answers. She had learned that Daniel's cover had likely been blown, and that he had probably been kidnapped by the drug trafficking organization he was investigating. But she was no closer to finding him or determining his fate. The case continued to haunt her. She kept Daniel's photo on her desk and thought about him every day. She attended church regularly, praying for his safe return and for the strength to continue her search. Her faith had been shaken by his disappearance, but it had not been broken. Sam Bailey, meanwhile, had been quietly conducting his own investigation. He had used his FBI contacts to gather intelligence on the drug trafficking network that Daniel had been investigating. He had learned that the organization was larger and more sophisticated than originally thought, with connections to criminal groups throughout South America and the Caribbean. In 2012, 4 years after Daniel's disappearance, Sam received a tip from an informant in Colombia. The informant claimed that an American had been held prisoner by a drug cartel in the Amazon basin, and that the man matched Daniel's description. Sam immediately contacted Agent Mendoza, who organized a joint operation with Colombian authorities to investigate the lead. The operation took place in a remote area of the Colombian Amazon, hundreds of miles from any major city. The terrain was difficult and dangerous, with dense jungle and unpredictable weather. The team spent 2 weeks searching the area, using helicopters and boats to access remote camps and hideouts. They found evidence of recent human activity, abandoned camps, supply caches, and signs of forced labor. But they found no trace of Daniel Parker or any other American prisoner. The informant's information had been either inaccurate or deliberately misleading. Sam returned to Miami discouraged but not defeated. He had seen enough evidence to convince him that Daniel might still be alive, held captive somewhere in the vast wilderness of South America. The question was whether they would ever be able to find him. As the years passed, the case gradually faded from public attention. Daniel Parker became just another name in the FBI's files of missing agents, a reminder of the dangers that law enforcement officers faced every day. But for Grace Mitchell and Sam Bailey, the case remained very much alive. They continued to follow up on leads, no matter how tenuous. They maintained contact with Agent Mendoza and other international law enforcement contacts. They attended conferences and briefings, always hoping to hear some piece of information that might break the case open. In 2018, 10 years after Daniel's disappearance, Grace received a promotion to supervisory special agent. She was assigned to lead a new task force focused on international human trafficking, a role that would allow her to continue working on cases involving missing Americans abroad. Sam Bailey, meanwhile, had been promoted to senior agent and was working primarily on domestic terrorism cases. But he never stopped thinking about his missing partner, and he never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, Daniel would find his way home. The two colleagues maintained their friendship over the years, bonded by their shared experience and their commitment to finding their missing friend. They met regularly for coffee or dinner, always discussing the case and sharing any new information they had gathered. Neither of them could have imagined that the breakthrough they had been hoping for would come not from their professional investigations, but from an unexpected source, someone who had been carrying a terrible secret for 15 years. Chapter 4: The Friend's Revelation. In March 2023, 15 years after Daniel Parker's disappearance, Sam Bailey received a phone call that would change everything. He was at his desk in the Miami FBI field office, reviewing case files, when his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. "Agent Bailey, this is Thomas Rodriguez. I need to talk to you about Daniel Parker." Sam's blood ran cold. Thomas Rodriguez had been Daniel's roommate at the FBI Academy in Quantico, and they had remained close friends throughout their careers. But Thomas had been reassigned to the FBI's Los Angeles field office in 2007, and he had been notably absent from Daniel's memorial service. "Tommy," Sam said, using the nickname he remembered from their academy days, "where have you been, man? We tried to reach you when Daniel went missing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was shaky and filled with emotion. "Sam, I need to see you in person. There are things about Daniel's mission that you don't know. Things that I should have told you 15 years ago." Sam felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of things?" "Not over the phone. Can you meet me in Atlanta? I'm flying in tonight." They arranged to meet at a small diner near the airport, the same type of place where Daniel used to love having his quiet conversations. Sam called Grace Mitchell, who was now supervising her own task force, and asked her to join them. She agreed immediately, sensing the urgency in Sam's voice. The next evening, Sam and Grace sat across from Thomas Rodriguez in a corner booth of the diner. Thomas looked older than his 46 years, with gray streaks in his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes. He had lost weight since they last saw him, and there was a haunted quality to his expression. "I've been living with this secret for 15 years, Thomas began, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "Every day, I've wondered if I could have saved him. Every night, I've prayed for forgiveness." Grace leaned forward. "Thomas, what are you talking about?" Thomas took a deep breath and looked directly at his former colleagues. "Daniel didn't disappear during a routine undercover operation. He was betrayed. And I know who betrayed him because I was there." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. "You were in Brazil?" "I was part of the operation. A secret part." The Bureau suspected there was a leak in the Miami field office, someone who was feeding information to the drug traffickers. They sent me to Brazil under deep cover to investigate the leak from the inside. Grace felt her world spinning. You were spying on us? I was spying on everyone. My job was to monitor all communications related to Operation Crossroads and identify the source of the leak. I had complete access to Daniel's reports, his location, his contacts, everything. Sam's face had gone pale. And you found the leak? Thomas nodded grimly. It was Agent Carlos Mendoza. He was taking money from the traffickers to provide information about American law enforcement operations. He had been compromised for years. The revelation was staggering. Agent Mendoza had been leading the search for Daniel all these years, knowing full well what had happened to him. He had been playing the role of the concerned colleague while actively covering up his own involvement in Daniel's disappearance. How do you know this? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I was monitoring his communications. I saw him send encrypted messages to known trafficking contacts. I saw him receive payments through offshore accounts. And I saw him give Daniel's location to Eduardo Santos on the night he disappeared. Thomas reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I've been gathering evidence for 15 years. I have financial records, communication intercepts, witness statements, everything needed to prove what really happened. Sam stared at the folder as if it contained poison. Why didn't you come forward before? Why did you let us search for him all these years? Thomas's voice broke. Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of what would happen to my career. Because I convinced myself that Daniel might still be alive, and that exposing Mendoza might put him in even more danger. But now you're ready to talk? Mendoza retired last year. He's living comfortably in São Paulo on his government pension and his blood money. Meanwhile, Daniel's parents died never knowing what happened to their son. I can't live with that anymore. Grace opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Bank records showed regular payments to Mendoza from shell companies linked to known drug trafficking organizations. Communication intercepts revealed coded messages between Mendoza and his criminal contacts. Most damning of all were surveillance photos showing Mendoza meeting with Eduardo Santos just hours before Daniel's disappearance. There's more, Thomas continued. I know where Daniel was taken. I know what happened to him. Sam's hands clenched into fists. Tell us. After Eduardo Santos received Daniel's location from Mendoza, he arranged for Daniel to be kidnapped from his apartment. Daniel was taken to a warehouse in the industrial district, the same one you found traces of blood in, but he wasn't killed there. Thomas paused, gathering his courage for what came next. He was transported to a remote compound in the Amazon, about 300 miles from Manaus. The compound was run by a man called O'Shafe. His real name was Marco Vasconcelos. Daniel was held there for almost 6 months. Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. He was alive for 6 months? Yes, Vasconcelos was using him as leverage against American law enforcement. He was planning to trade Daniel for arrested associates or reduced sentences. But the negotiations never happened because Mendoza convinced his superiors that Daniel was already dead. Sam was struggling to control his emotions. What happened after 6 months? Thomas's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Daniel tried to escape. He almost made it. He got as far as the river before they caught him. Vasconcelos was furious. He had Daniel shot and his body thrown into the river. The diner fell silent except for the sound of Grace's quiet sobs. Sam sat in stunned silence, processing the information that his best friend had been alive for months after his disappearance, suffering in captivity while his colleagues searched for him. How do you know all this? Sam finally asked. Because I was there. I had infiltrated Vasconcelos' organization as part of my cover. I watched them bring Daniel to the compound. I saw him every day for 6 months, and I watched them kill him. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Grace looked up from the documents, her eyes red with tears and anger. You were there? You saw him being held prisoner, and you did nothing? I tried to help him. I passed him information about the compound layout, about guard schedules, about potential escape routes. I'm the one who told him about the river. I thought ... I thought he could make it. Sam stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You let him die. You could have saved him, and you let him die. I know, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. But if I had tried to rescue him openly, we both would have been killed. I was one man against an entire organization. Grace closed the folder and looked directly at Thomas. Where is Daniel's body? I don't know exactly. The river carried it away. But I know where he was killed. I can take you there. Sam sat back down, his anger giving way to a profound sadness. Why are you telling us this now? Why not 5 years ago, or 10 years ago? Thomas met his gaze steadily. Because I found out that Mendoza is planning to write a book about the case. He's going to portray himself as the hero, the dedicated agent who never gave up searching for his American colleague. I can't let that happen. I can't let Daniel's memory be tainted by that man's lies. Grace wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. What do you want us to do? Help me bring Mendoza to justice. Help me expose the truth about what happened to Daniel. And help me find some way to make amends for my cowardice. Sam looked at his former colleague, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. It won't bring Daniel back. No, but it might give his memory the justice it deserves. And it might prevent something like this from happening to another agent. Grace nodded slowly. We'll need to involve the Justice Department. This is going to be a complex international case. I know. I'm prepared to testify about everything. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions. The 3 agents spent the next 4 hours going through Thomas's evidence in detail. The case he had built was thorough and convincing. Agent Carlos Mendoza had been a traitor, selling information to drug traffickers and directly responsible for Daniel Parker's death. Thomas Rodriguez had been a witness to that betrayal and to Daniel's subsequent murder, and he had kept silent for 15 years out of fear and self-preservation. As the evening wore on, Sam found himself thinking about Daniel's faith and his commitment to justice. Daniel had believed that God had called him to serve others, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. He had died trying to protect innocent people from the poison of drug trafficking, betrayed by someone he trusted. There's something else, Thomas said as they prepared to leave. Something I haven't told you yet. Grace looked up from the documents. What? Daniel knew. In the end, he knew that Mendoza had betrayed him. He figured it out during his captivity. He asked me to give you a message if anything happened to him. Sam felt his throat tighten. What message? He said to tell you that he forgave everyone involved. He said that holding on to anger and hatred would only give the darkness more power. He said that justice was important, but that revenge was not. Grace smiled through her tears. That sounds like Daniel. He also said that he wasn't afraid. He said that he knew where he was going, and that he would be waiting for all of us when our time came. Sam nodded, remembering his friend's unshakable faith. He always did have a better relationship with God than the rest of us. As they left the diner, Grace, Sam, and Thomas made a pact. They would work together to expose the truth about Daniel Parker's death and to bring Carlos Mendoza to justice. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't bring Daniel back, but it would honor his memory and ensure that his sacrifice was not forgotten. Over the following months, the 3 agents worked with federal prosecutors to build a case against Mendoza. The evidence was overwhelming, and the former agent was eventually arrested and extradited to the United States to face charges of corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. The trial was a media sensation, with Thomas Rodriguez as the star witness. He testified about his 15 years of silence, his role in the operation, and his knowledge of Daniel's fate. The courtroom was packed with FBI agents, many of whom had known and worked with Daniel Parker. Carlos Mendoza was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final statement to the court, he showed no remorse, claiming that he had been justified in his actions because American law enforcement had no right to operate in Brazil. Daniel Parker's parents had both died in the years since his disappearance, But his sister, Victoria Evans, attended the trial every day. She approached Thomas Rodriguez after the verdict was announced and thanked him for finally telling the truth. "I know you think you failed my brother," she said, "but he wouldn't want you to carry that guilt forever. He would want you to use this experience to help others." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm going to try. I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure that no other agent is betrayed the way Daniel was." Grace Mitchell and Sam Bailey remain close friends and colleagues, bonded by their shared experience and their commitment to Daniel's memory. They established a foundation in his name to provide support for the families of law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. The case served as a reminder of the dangers that law enforcement officers face every day, and of the importance of integrity and loyalty in the fight against crime. It also demonstrated the power of faith and forgiveness, values that Daniel Parker had embodied throughout his life and even in his death. In the end, Daniel's disappearance had revealed a truth that was both tragic and inspiring. He had been betrayed by someone he trusted, killed by criminals he was trying to stop, and forgotten by a system that should have protected him. But he had also been remembered by friends who refused to give up on him, and his legacy lived on in the work of those who continued to fight for justice in his name. The investigation into Daniel Parker's disappearance had finally come to an end, but the impact of his life and death would continue to inspire law enforcement officers for generations to come. He had paid the ultimate price for his dedication to serving others, but his sacrifice had not been in vain. In a world often filled with darkness, Daniel Parker had been a light that continued to shine even after his death.